And welcome to this introduction to Enzyme, the new synth plugin from Humanoid Sound Systems. Enzyme is not just another virtual analog synth. At its heart lies an implementation of the scanned synthesis technique, which conceptually sits somewhere between traditional wavetable synthesis and physical modelling. The wavetables used in Enzyme are constantly changing according to a complex model of masses and springs, which we can interact with via performance controls, or modulate with traditional envelopes and LFOs, to create sounds that evolve and change in interesting and unusual ways. More on the synthesis method itself later. Let's start in more familiar territory on the master page, where we find conventional controls for pitch bend range, coarse and fine tuning, and options to load Scala tuning files. Preset management is at the bottom, with banks in the right-hand panel and presets in the left. Let's try the incendiary bass preset. And notice that the first 6 performance controls above now have names defined, such as remove grit, low pass pluck, or unison. These performance controls have been assigned by the sound designers to control important parameters, or groups of parameters, and provide a quick and easy way to explore variations of the basic preset. As with all the knobs on the interface, I can right-click and MIDI learn these performance controls, so I can use hardware knobs or faders to tweak the sound. Unlike the other parameters, however, performance control assignments are global for all presets and all instances of the synth. So if I load a different preset, such as bass mortar, the performance controls are still assigned. The first one is now labelled LFO rate, and sure enough, it changes the speed of the wobble articulation, stepping through various fractions of the project tempo. However, what if I wanted the knob to speed up the wobble instead of slow it down? Let's switch to the Modulation tab to reveal the modulation matrix. Here we have all active modulators listed along the top, including the performance controls, and all active destinations listed on the left. So it's easy to see that Performance Control 1 is set to control the second modulation destination, LFO2 rate, and that it's set to a negative amount. Let's turn the knob the other way instead, and switch back to the master page. And sure enough, the first performance control now speeds up the wobble instead of slowing it down. Let's add a tiny touch of portamento so notes glide into each other. Okay, now let's try clearing the preset and dialing in a sound from scratch. I want to play chords, so the first thing I'll do is turn down the voice amp knob to reduce the volume levels and give me some more headroom. Now let's switch to the Modulation tab, where we find a conventional AHDSR volume envelope at the bottom. And I'll dial in longer attack and release times for a pad type envelope shape. Notice that, unlike the presets we looked at earlier, the modulation panel above is empty. Let's switch back to the master page, right-click the voice amp knob I adjusted earlier, and add to Mod Matrix. And sure enough, voice amp is now listed as a possible destination, and I can link it to any of the performance controls by turning up the relevant knob. I'm going to do something more interesting, however. I'll click Add Modulator and choose an LFO, which then appears in the modulators box to the left. If I scroll right, we see LFO1 now appears after the performance controls as an available modulation source, and I can turn up the knob below to link it to the voice amp parameter. The LFO itself is set to sync mode, so is locked to the host tempo. Let's turn up the rate knob to set a 1/4 beat division. Let's make this more complex. I'll create another LFO and scroll right again. And sure enough, we have another LFO modulation source at the end of the list. Let's turn up the knob to modulate the volume from LFO2 as well, and set a different sync value. And the result is a more complex pattern of modulation. The matrix is obviously a powerful feature, allowing any parameter to be modulated simultaneously by any or all active modulation sources. It goes deeper still, however. Let's control-click both modulation depth knobs to reset them to 0. Then right-click the LFO1 depth knob and add this to the matrix as well. We now have another entire row of modulation knobs below, all dedicated to the LFO1 amp modulation depth. So I can turn up the first knob and use Performance Control 1 to introduce the amplitude modulation. Or I can scroll right and control the LFO1 modulation depth using LFO2. In this case, it might be better to switch off bipolar mode for LFO2, so it produces only positive values instead of oscillating between positive and negative. We can go even further if required. Let's reset the modulation depth to 0 again. Right-click and add this knob to the matrix as well. Then scroll left and link it to Performance Control 1. So the first performance control now introduces complex modulation from both LFOs. Okay, now let's switch to the Synthesis tab and look at the main synthesis parameters. Here we can control the shape and size of the virtual hammer that excites the system, the shape of the center wave to which it is trying to return, and the pattern of masses arranged along it. The resulting system is then scanned at audio rates to produce the waveform we see above. The shape of the hammer is defined by an audio sample, which we can pick from the list. Simple single-cycle waveforms, such as the saw or square shapes, will produce relatively static sounds, with a hint of the characteristics you might expect of that waveform in more conventional subtractive synthesis. You can also click the field in the waveform display to load your own samples, and drag the handles on the display to adjust looping points if needed. Longer and more complex samples will have more movement and variation in the sound, as each time the system is updated, a new single-cycle hammer shape will be extracted from the source sample. We also have parameters to set the size of the hammer, the tightness of the connecting springs, and we can scale the center waveform, also defined by a sample, and adjust the force pulling nodes towards their resting position. A third sample defines the distribution of mass among the nodes, and we can stretch or scale this sample. And furthermore, we can change the way the nodes are connected to each other via the connection matrix menu over to the right. Some of these matrices, such as drum, random, or opposite, can have their configurations further altered via the warp parameter to the left. And the stereo width knob adjusts warp for just the right channel to encourage differences between the channels. As these parameters all interact, it can be difficult to predict the effect of changing any one of them, but experimenting with the parameters and with different combinations of samples will reward you with distinctive and unique sounds. More predictably, the update rate knob controls how often the system is updated, so it can be used to control how quickly the sounds evolve and change. And the number of oscillators knob introduces multiple detuned voices for a rich unison effect. Alternatively, we can switch to harmonic mode below, which stacks the extra voices at harmonic multiples of the fundamental frequency. or 3 variations of harmonic mode, in which the extra oscillators are scaled in volume according to the hammer, center, or mass shapes. If the selected shape is a single cycle waveform, the oscillator levels will remain static, while longer samples will introduce changes over time, as each update of the system extracts a new single cycle wave from the sample. We can further spice up the sound by frequency modulating the oscillators, with a frequency control for the modulating oscillator, and a choice of waveforms. Or you may want to try Psycho mode, which lifts the safety limits from the wavetables for a wilder, more chaotic sound. Or Danger mode, taken from early versions of Enzyme's predecessor, Scanned Synth Pro, and with a much more aggressive sound. Or even try both together, though you may want to turn the volume down to compensate for the extra gain. Okay, let's move back into more familiar territory and switch to the Effects tab, which also includes a pair of resonant filters with a range of different filter types and a choice between serial or parallel configurations. I'll right-click the cutoff knobs and add them both to the matrix. Then switch back to the Modulation tab, link the first filter to another performance control. And let's create another modulator for filter 2. As well as unlimited LFOs, we can create extra AHDSR envelopes, or add keyboard tracking and velocity sensitivity via the note property modulators. I'm going to add an audio property modulator, however, which uses the hammer, mass shape, or center wave properties from the synthesis section. And I'll scroll right and modulate filter 2 with the hammer amplitude. So the movement of this filter is related to the movement in the basic tone. Switching back to the Effects tab, we find an Effects rack, to which we can add distortion modules or more filters, modulation effects, or delay and reverb. And we can freely change the order of effects. Or we can add effects parameters to the mod matrix to be modulated or linked to performance controls, or both. Enzyme's combination of a unique synthesis method and an extremely powerful and flexible modulation system is capable of creating unusual and distinctive tones unlike any of your more conventional synths. But if you ever feel overwhelmed by the possibilities, or simply stuck for inspiration, try pressing the Randomize button at the bottom. This intelligent function randomizes almost every parameter in Enzyme and can produce surprising and unexpected results. That's all I've got time for in this video. Thanks for watching.